Thank you so much. All right, well, good morning. Really glad to be here. So today, I'm really excited to talk to you a little bit about managing stakeholders, and this is going to be kind of like hopefully a pragmatic approach to doing data science for business in the real world. I'll try to keep it to that. So who am I? My name is Lauren Oldja, and I'm a data scientist at Spark Beyond. I have about 6 years experience in stakeholder management on projects of various types. And so I feel slightly qualified to talk about this. I'm actually kind of a newbie to design thinking myself, so be gentle in the comments if that's something that you're going to talk about. But there's going to be other tidbits in here as well. So just to give you a brief outline, we're going to talk about how to identify a stakeholder, what is a stakeholder, and then maybe some techniques for empathy and trust, building that up. Talking about how to select a use case with kind of this design thinking mindset. And also, really, really important whenever you're working with a client or something like this is setting expectations. So Spark Beyond is a client-facing role. It's a client-facing company where data scientists, we work on an auto ML platform and use it to work on clients' problems, data problems, and those clients are various sizes, sometimes small public companies, sometimes large Fortune 500s. I think the use cases that I'm going to talk about today are kind of the smaller companies. Large companies, it gets a little bit tricky politically at times, and so we'll keep the conversation a little bit more focused. But my hope is that even if you're not client-facing, this will still be a valuable talk for you, because I think many of the techniques that you can use here with an outside team, external to your company, can also be used kind of internally. Sometimes as a data scientist, you're a bit siloed, and it takes some political maneuvering, let's say, to convince people that you do something that's useful for them, and it's not just like analysis that sits on a shelf and they want to see the numbers, but then they do whatever they want. So hopefully you'll be able to take some techniques away. And kind of the other part of the motivation for this talk is that for as much as I tried to find headlines to put here that's like, AI is magic. And when I was searching for it, it was all these headlines that are like, AI is not magic. But like, even though those are the headlines, we know that there's people out there that think AI is magic, right? So it comes up in conversation all the time. It's all the the Elon Musk stuff of the world that people have been sold on. I couldn't find any particular picture to put here, but it's true. You know that people in their mind, they think about that. So let's talk about identifying stakeholders. Let's get real. So where does this concept of stakeholder come from? It was kind of interesting. I did a little bit of research into it because we talk about stakeholders, but where is this actually from? So in the 1950s, there was this approach to thinking about a company as a closed system, right? And then it wasn't until the 80s that systems thinkers started to say, no, actually, companies are open systems, and they're subject to their environment and the choices of their customers and things like this. And so this is not a particularly customer-centric diagram, as you can see when this was first published in '81, but it is a recognition that there's multiple forces that a company really needs to think about, right? And I want you to take that mindset when you're thinking about your data science project, right? There's going to be multiple, you're an open system, right? There's going to be multiple things that you need to kind of scan for and be aware of. So a stakeholder is anyone who's affected by or has an interest in your project. And the traditional approach would be to just kind of like fill in this chart, right? And at first I was kind of skeptical, right? Like, okay, that's kind of, I don't know, we'll see if this is useful. You got the contact person, the power, and the interest. And if you fill it in, it might look something like this. So just to split it up on slides, this is the business side, right? So maybe you've got the C-suite and perhaps they receive the steer code deck. Maybe they look at it. Maybe they don't. They probably only get involved if they have like a specific ask or if they become interested later. Oh, we're paying this third-party vendor anyway. Let's see what they can do for us, right? That's kind of the C-suite mentality. Project managers. Oftentimes, the project manager is managing just 1 or 2 or 3 projects, right? So they may be promoted if your project goes well, so they're incredibly engaged. And they're also kind of your best point of contact, excuse me, to ask who knows what introductions can they make for you on the client side. Okay, the business vertical owners would be like your KPI owners, and you're going to want to engage them heavily, but there's a lot of demands on their time. They're kind of like middle management, right? So you're not the only thing that they're working on. And then, of course, there's the field, right? If you want your thing to eventually be actionable, it's very important to consider that there is this field component, that you are going to make recommendations for experiments that you want them to run, perhaps, right? Things that you want them to change. But there might be additional incentives that, for example, they don't want to change it because, all right, so I'll give you like a real example, right? That's what you're here for. So let's say that you want to change how different insurance agents are hired, right? Hired and fired and things like this, but the results of your analysis may or may not be used because you didn't understand that the people on the ground make the ultimate decision for hiring and firing, right? And that their pay is linked to it, right? So they're not easily going to change what they know works based on, some outsider's one-off analysis, right? So it's just kind of understanding the interests and incentives of the field is really important. Okay, this is getting a little verbose, but stick with me. There's also the technology side. So we have the business side, here's the technology side. And so here in this theoretical example that we filled in here, your sponsor is actually the CIO, right? And they provide the budget and maybe a little bit of the strategic vision, but realistically, they're not super engaged with the business side. They kind of want to show that they're doing something cool by bringing in third parties, but it's a technology directive, and we'll see why that's a problem in a second. Then we also have our data engineer. Maybe they're on a temporary contract, right? They've been hired just to help you with the data polls, to support the project, so they're extremely motivated. You got IT, which is extremely demotivated because they've got plenty on their plate already, and who is this one-off person that we're going to be working with for a couple of months. You got the data scientists who are super excited to be working with you. Finally, they get a friend, someone that knows and speaks their language, but maybe their boss isn't involved in this project at all, and you have no idea what the demands on their time are, right? So you can kind of fill this out, and you can start to see the usefulness of it. I don't know that it's like the most useful thing, but and before I forget, most importantly, although this kind of drops by the wayside, is in stakeholder analysis, you have to consider who's actually going to be affected in the end, right? So who are the end users? And in this case, like the debit card users or the direct deposit users, they can leave, they can go to another competitor's product, and they have competing interests. And whether or not you engage them is kind of, it would be good to engage them, but realistically, I haven't seen that too often. Okay, so in the traditional approach, again, so how would we actually use this? So you would maybe make a graph that's like interest versus power, and then you kind of like plot where people land, and then that gives you a strategy. And I don't know. I don't like this part of the traditional approach, right? I think this is not very useful because what does it mean to what does it mean to monitor the IT, right? How? What? How are you going to keep informed the data engineer, right? So it doesn't quite map on very interestingly, but what you do get from doing this process is identifying really, really key players, right? So your really key player here is definitely going to be your KPI owner, right? Going through this process and listing out who has the biggest interest in your key performance indicator, right? Who has key performance indicators that they collect data on, and who is measured against those, and who has the incentive to improve those, and who knows where that data sits, right? Your KPI owner is actually your most critical person. And also doing this can maybe make you understand that you actually had the wrong point of entry, right? So our sponsor in this case is not the KPI owner. It's someone that's been hired recently. They want to kind of show off. They're hoping that you help them do that, right? And there's the promise of scaling to other regions if it goes well, but they have other projects, right? And it's kind of like they're going to remove all the bottlenecks for you, but they're not necessarily going to be able to provide you with what you need to get started, right? Like just being on the ground doesn't get you a predictive problem and something where you could, put a model into production. So let's think for a second with a kind of a more design thinking approach, right? So the traditional approach is okay. You get some things out of it. I think it's a little, handwriting-y for what you get out of it, but it's okay. It's good to think it through and do it with your team. But in design thinking, you really want to think about pains, gains, and jobs to be done. So for example, we could really dive deep into this KPI owner, right? So what are their pains in this debit card company, prepaid debit card company? Fraudulent disputes are highly regulated. That's a major pain for them, right? They're constrained in their actions. They contract out their customer service, right? Maybe overseas. And so they don't have direct control over that, although they can kind of make recommendations or a playbook. But as far as being on the ground, they are not co-located with customer service. That's a pain. Not all chargebacks to merchants that are possible have been charged back, right? If you book a hotel room and then you decide not to, right? Like sometimes that money doesn't get charged back, and so not all the chargebacks that were possible and are allowed by regulation have been charged back. These are their pains, right? And you can start to see how by listing these out, the pains, the gains, the jobs to be done, you can get a better sense of okay, this is starting to sound a little bit more like a predictive problem that I would want to work on, right? How can we find fraudulent disputes that, or how can we find disputes that are most likely to be fraudulent, right? And ones that are not unavailable to us through regulation, right? That sounds like a good predictive problem. Yeah, we can go over the gains. Motivated team is experienced in machine learning, is not experienced in machine learning, but understands the data, understands its business. That's really critical, right? You might have to kind of go in circles to figure out what a machine learning problem is in order for, for a person like this, you might need to iterate with them a little bit to kind of figure out where to land as far as all right, how do we structure this question? But at least they know their business. And then jobs to be done. Okay, so let's not beat that to death. But I did want to bring up to you, so I talked a little bit about entry point. And entry point is it's pretty important when you're working with clients in that you need a champion for your project, right? And I really like this framework from T4G because really it says that, okay, we've got unhappy people kind of on the left, which is the technology side, and happy people on the business side. And the idea is that if you want your project to focus more on making an impact on the business, then you don't want to take a tools-based mindset, right? You really want to be brought in by someone that has a problem and needs you to help them solve it, rather than to be brought in by someone that says, hey, let's apply, the latest stuff to whatever I'm working on. You say, well, what are you working on? They say, just do it, just stuff, right? So here the technology directive is extremely unhappy. Here you've got the KPI owner is the best place to land. In our case, our entry point was kind of, in this example, the technology directive. But because they were CIO, I didn't want to put it totally in the unhappy face, right? Because I think it's like, they could get rid of the bottlenecks. They could break down the barriers. But it still kind of was a tool-based mission at first. And to be honest, so this is from a real-life example. It took us probably 2-3 months of like circling around to really find a data set that we could work on and answer a business problem that did matter. So if you've got that kind of runway to like iterate and spend 2-3 months figuring out your use case, then it's fine. But if you don't have that kind of time, then maybe you need to consider what your entry point is a little bit more seriously. Okay, building trust and empathy. So the goal of stakeholder engagement is to turn affected parties into participants in the process. To turn affected parties into the participants of the process. And so a great way to do this is actually in person, face-to-face. And when you're planning your first visit, the idea is that you want to build that kind of professional trust. You want to check in with your stakeholders, make sure that you kind of understand who they are, that your assumptions about them make sense, and you want to make sure that you're able to introduce your two teams. But the timing of it is really important, because you must have at least received one data delivery. You do not have a project if you have not seen their data. The project cannot start, I emphasize this, the project cannot start without any data. You need to have at least kind of seen a sample of it. You have to have some idea of what they're collecting. You probably haven't done a full quality analysis at this point. You probably haven't architected out their schema, but you need to know something is there before you can start with them. And ideally, you've done some EDA, find some outliers, look at distributions, and you should probably also try to map out business processes to the best of your ability at this point, so that you can bring those with you and actually iterate on them, highlight the unknowns, and get those questions answered. Because these are the kinds of things that are really better to do face-to-face, and you might not have so many opportunities. Even when you go to visit, you might only have an hour, so you want to use it strategically. And so here's some actions that you can take on site. Most likely you won't even see the CEO, and that's fine. But you do want to make sure that you're spending close time with your project manager on their side. And hopefully they exist, right? You don't necessarily have a project manager on the other side, but it's good to kind of identify that is a role that you want, that's a persona that you should request, and it's a useful thing to have for sure, but it's not always guaranteed. And then you can verify your understanding of all the stakeholders with them, identify new ones. With your KPI owners, you really want to focus on the You want to really focus on why you're going to do things, right? So I've put here, it's kind of confusing the way I put it here. You want to align the project how with the why. So how is the tools you're going to use, but why is what matters, right? Why is always what matters, and it sounds simple when we say it like this, but it's easy to get lost in the contracts and in the salesmanship, that the why is really what matters. And so you really want to align on strategic KPIs. You should also verify that you know what actionable levers you can take, right? Can you actually change the hiring process? Can you actually, in the case of regulated things, can you actually identify fraudulent transactions and not refund those, right? Something like that. So, yeah. And then for the field, you may or may not have access to the field on your on-site, right? Field is probably not co-located with headquarters, but to the extent possible, you should try to find someone that is an owner of the field process, right? So interview them to understand and map the business processes, verify all your actionable levers. And on the technology side, it's really good to just kind of touch base and know these people because they're the ones that you're going to be working with. right? And so any outstanding issues that you have with IT, you can take care of. With your data scientists, it's really good to map out what actually are the data sources that are available to you. And really to talk about when is data collected, right? So what are your best sources of truth for the problem that you're thinking about working on? What are the sampling biases? When does data get updated? And so let's talk a little bit about selecting a use case. So if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. And that's how it can feel with the use case at times. But that's why it's really important to scope it out. So again, let's focus on the KPIs, right? A KPI is great because someone already decided it was important, and likely they've been measuring it and they have data on that historically, right? So these problems are usually well studied, and it's something that machine learning can enhance. And that's really the sweet spot for you. It might be harder to sell it in the beginning because, again, people want the magic, but this is definitely not the magic. This is just like an iterative improvement on existing business processes that'll hopefully make everyone more money and make them happier in the end. So, couple of different strategies for finding a use case. So you can look at, so one of the strategies I mentioned it earlier is to bring materials in advance. So when you're bringing materials in advance to the onsite, what does that look like? You should write down which data sources you think you're going to use for each analysis path. You should highlight anything that's unusual in your EDA process if you've been able to complete that at this point. Look at outliers, look at unexpected distributions. These are the hints. These are the keys that can help you with what should be a very open-ended interview process, right? You don't want to come in necessarily having your list of 5 questions, and then those are the 5 questions you want answered. You could do that over email, right? The benefit of face-to-face is that you can actually kind of iterate over questions, and you say, like, all right, well, what does that mean? Or tell me more, right? Or did I understand this correctly? These are the kinds of things that you can use. Another great thing to use is, and this one's real, this is from the debit card process, and hopefully it's tiny enough that it protects identities. I cropped it at the top, so it's fine. So you can draw out the business process, right? And this obviously doesn't happen all in one go. For this, by the way, we use Lucid Charts, which is like a tool, but I'm sure there's plenty of free ones available out there too. So each diamond is a decision point, if you're not familiar with flow diagrams. But it's really helpful, like, as you are iterating and talking with people and having conversations, that you're also taking that knowledge and formalizing it somehow so that you can bring it back to them and say, did I understand properly, right? Did I get it right? And oftentimes you'll say, like, oh, no, I thought that this was just one decision, but actually now there's 4 parallel processes, right? It brings up those kinds of questions, and it's useful to have those kind of conversations. Because really, so, to link it back, we're talking about use cases, right? And you might be working on one thing now, and if you have a good, strong first problem in mind, then that's great. You may or may not have that. But you're going to want to try to find out what are their major pain points, right? Are you working on the problem that is the most important, right? Because you can always reprioritize, allocate additional resources, right? And you want to ultimately be working on something that matters the most to the company. So it's really very valuable to map this out, and they say, okay, well, we were working over here, but now that we think about it, like, that over there is a major pain point for us, and let's talk about how we can solve that problem too. Oh, okay, so I had this here. Targeted and open-ended questions, draw out iterations. Yeah, and request feedback. Perfect. Okay, this is one of my favorite ones. Another strategy that you can take in doing finding your use cases or doing an analysis like this is conduct a pre-mortem, right? It's not a post-mortem, it's a pre-mortem. So before the patient's dead, what could possibly go wrong, right? And this is a bit open-ended, but it's kind of a nice mindset to take to things. It's like, okay, wait, let's imagine that we're a couple of months from now. What happened? So setting expectations. Setting expectations is really important in life, in client work, in communication, probably very much internally to your company. Setting expectations is absolutely critical. So let's spend a couple of minutes on this, and then I think we'll wrap up. Establishing a communication cadence in advance is really important. This comes from the kind of slide that you could share at the very beginning at kickoff with your clients, with your own team, and it is the kind of thing that gets everyone on the same page. It can be hard to imagine into the future how you're going to work with these strangers. So this is not necessarily the only way to do it, but you need a way to start. And any other changes to your communication cadence, it'd probably be good to revise this and then put it in writing and send it out again, right? Just to make sure that everyone's on the same page. Because you have to remember, this might be your number one priority, but it is definitely not everyone else's number one priority. Definitely not all your stakeholders, and especially not your executives, right? So making sure that they have the most up-to-date information, they can refer to it, is really very useful. I think it increases transparency in the process, which also allows you to build trust. So. And then this is a kind of a tricky one, all right? Everyone wants to be agile. Should you scrum? What do you guys think? No? I heard a no. All right, so I'm not a big fan of scrumming, right? So scrumming is when you time box things, right? You say, okay, we're gonna have 2-week sprints. And for this 2-week sprint, this is our goal. And we're gonna work on this, and then we're going to present our results, and then we're going to have a little bit of time at the end to reflect on it, and everyone's going to talk about it, and we're going to set our next goal for the next scrum. And realistically, in data science, I don't think it works. I really don't think it works at all, because you don't know, it's really hard to time box a data science problem. It's really hard to chunk up a data science problem into, parts that make sense, right? So much of data science is iterative, and you go back and forth, and you try to figure out what you were doing or where you started, and it can be hard to show intermediate results, right? What is an MVP of a model? Well, it's just a model, right? And then you increase it, you make it better, but until you have that, right? If you're trying to join in different data sources and stuff, it might totally reframe how you've written it out in the first place. So personally, I'm not a big fan of scrumming. I haven't seen it work. I'd be happy to be proven wrong. But that said, I don't think that agile, you shouldn't throw out agile, right? Because there's actually, I don't know if you're familiar. So there's another process called Kanban, and you say, I wish I had pulled up a Trello board here. I'll put it in post, where you can create a backlog of projects, and then you just say what you're working on, right? And you allow yourself to only stage a certain number, to commit to a certain number of projects at any given time, right? And those can be reprioritized, but only the things that you have committed to will be worked on. And then you've got a work in progress area, and then you complete it, right? And so it kind of moves through the Trello board, and I think it's very good. A couple of things couple of tips. I would not let your client reprioritize your board directly, perhaps for obvious reasons, but I do think that it's useful for someone on your side, if that's possible, to have daily touch points with someone on the client side. Hopefully not you, because you're focused and doing scientific work, and coding is hard to split up into between meetings, let's say. But Yeah, so if you have a project manager on your side, I would say touch base with them periodically based on their daily conversations with the client and reprioritize accordingly, right? And that should allow you the best balance between focus and control. Okay, and then just quickly, because this is really, really important, you got to be able to push back. You got to be able to say no. But the thing is, you can never say no. You can never say no because you don't want to say no, right? You want to say yes, but you want to understand where the request is coming from, and then you want to say what you need, right? So this is the political maneuvering. This is the jujitsu, right? You don't say no, you say yes, but you say, well, what do you need, right? So there's two kinds of no's that you should say. There's the no to scope creep, and there's the no to a nonsense request. And if it's a nonsense request, you just got to keep asking questions like why? Why do you want to do that? And then what would we do with it? And how would that be useful? And who's going to use it, right? Just keep kind of pushing back on it, but you're never really saying the word NO, right? You can kind of have that conversation, and it's going to be a lot more fruitful, and people will think you're a lot easier to work with. On the left-hand side, scope creep is real, and you need to push back against it. There's only one of you. Even if there's more of you than that, there's only n number of you, right? And so people will come up with a million ideas, and you need to figure out what they actually want, right? So someone says, hey, can you also do X analysis? You say, yeah, absolutely. Does that deprioritize what I'm currently working on, right? Is that more important than what I'm currently working on, right? Force the conversation into prioritization, and you never have to say no to scope creep. And on the other side, you could request additional resources, right? You say, yeah, absolutely, we can do that. I've got a colleague that could come onto this project, and then we'll have two of us working on it. That's less ideal because the larger number of people that you have working on a project, the more points of communication failure there are, right? And it scales kind of like geometrically, so you don't really want to add more people to your project if you can help it, but it's another way to push back if they say, no, both of these are high priority, right? These are both high priority projects. Everything's high priority, right? That's what I heard. So that's it. My name is Lauren Oldja. I'm a data scientist, and find me around the conference. Thanks so much.